What is the most important step a man can take? It's not the first one, it's the next one. Always the next step. The measure of a man is what he does with power. Those words greeted me as I first booted up the game. Not Knights of the Old Republic, mind you, but rather God of War 3, which is using a 2,400-year-old quote to introduce me to what was then the final chapter of Kratos' story. The overlap in philosophies between Knights of the Old Republic, which I shall call KOTOR from now on, and the God of War games is quite significant. But since I have already spent 6+ hours talking about Kratos and friends, let's focus on how Plato's words apply to this story from a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's remarkable how timeless and universally applicable that statement is. KOTOR, being a CRPG, has leveling up and thus increasing power as one of its core elements. The difference between the weakling who could barely hold a vibroblade and the dual lightsaber-wielding Jedi who plowed through wave after wave of Sith warriors could hardly be starker. By the end of this game, you are an absolute wrecking ball, quite possibly the most powerful individual in the galaxy, and you have a choice to make.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
That is where this video's sponsor, Delete Me, comes into play, helping you keep your information safe and out of the hands of data brokers who want to sell it. If you don't already know what data brokers are, let me break it down for you real quick. They scrape data about you from a huge variety of sources, including government records and social media, put together a profile, and then offer that up for sale to whomever wants to pay for it. This puts you at risk of threats such as phishing scams, where a bad actor will take information they've bought about you and try to trick you into installing malware on your computer, wiring them money or the like. With Delete Me, I can easily and quickly get my data removed from hundreds of data broker websites. Despite running a YouTube channel, I try to be private about my information online, and yet Delete Me still found brokers with my name, address, past addresses, relatives, and more. Delete Me does this automatically, so I can personally trust them to stay on top of protecting my personal data. You can get 20% off of Delete Me US customer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Samwise and use promo code Samwise at checkout. That is joindeleteme.com/Samwise, code Samwise. Many thanks to Delete Me for helping to keep my data safe and for sponsoring this video.
And now, back to our program.
That freedom to choose is, of course, what made this game so remarkable when it was released. The decisions you made during the course of your playthrough really mattered. The way events would play out was dependent on you. The player was granted at the time unparalleled freedom in a video game, given incredible power to shape his or her journey, and thus the responsibility to carry the weight of those choices. KOTOR is a game where you get out what you put in. It's not a tightly woven narrative carefully crafted by an expert storyteller, but rather an opportunity for you to experience an adventure that is all your own, with every reward and consequence earned by your choices. I like to think this is why the main character isn't voiced, although I'm sure there were some budgetary motivations there too. Not having your character speak at all forced you to imagine yourself saying those lines, and also it gave you the option to name your own character, which voice acting obviously would not allow for. So when you succeeded, it felt like your triumph, and when you failed, it hit home extra hard. For example, I did a bad thing in the first third of this game. I mostly chalk it up to not knowing how the opaque dialogue tree system worked, but when I, Darman Scarata, a name only the finest of Star Wars nerds will recognize, was asked to clear the dark stain of a grove on Dantooine and found a distraught, rash, lost, and confused Jedi apprentice there, I did what I thought was my best to turn her back to the light, to convince her that she could be forgiven and redeemed, even though she had struck down her old master in a fit of dark-side-induced madness. And this conviction that anyone at any time, no matter their sins, can choose to be better than they once were, is one I hold dearly. And yet it seemed to me that Juhani was unwilling to make that choice. Oh, I tried to persuade her a couple of times, but being a very dumb CRPG player, I didn't think that maybe, just maybe, the lower dialogue options would lead to a better solution than the one I ultimately opted for. And then I realized that there is a slot in the companion matrix where Juhani's head would fit perfectly. Oops. At least I tried, right? I offered her redemption, I just wasn't convincing enough. She still had a choice, no? Well, yes, she did, but so did I. I gave up on Juhani just as she gave up on herself. I acquiesced to her request for death rather than pursuing every available way to avoid the fatal option. That exchange highlights a fundamental truth about the choices we make. They aren't made in a vacuum. Our past actions, our temperament, and the influence of others all exert significant pressure on our wills. Juhani could have accepted my feeble attempt to persuade her, not according to the game's code perhaps, but from a metaphysical viewpoint that looks at these characters as actual people with free wills and not merely ones and zeros strung together. But she freely chose not to. My pitiful persuasion plus her half-baked belief in her own possibility of redemption were not strong enough to overcome her self-hatred and allow her to forgive herself. I find this a fascinating concept to ponder, because when we look at people who are not constrained by the invisible code, decision blocks, and persuasion points of KOTOR, that is, actual people, we understand that we can choose to do just about anything at any time, at least in theory. In reality, we often find our will insufficient to overcome a certain challenge, absent external motivators making up for our lack of willpower. This pathetic failed attempt to save Juhani's life demonstrates the truth that we need others to help us overcome difficulties in our life. Whether that is as simple as having a gym buddy to keep us accountable and ensure we don't skip leg day, or a spouse who takes it upon himself or herself to watch over our own well-being and help us through our deepest and most difficult battles. And of course, the flip side to we need others is others need us. It's hard to determine the strength of will that a loved one has when facing a given challenge, and so we need to be unreserved and unconditional in our love and care for them, doing all we can to ensure their safety, provide for their needs, and attain their good. If their will plus our aid isn't enough, well, there's a part of me, a large part, that wants to say that I don't need the wisdom, guidance, or encouragement of others. That I can think my way around my problems and push through any obstacles. I can be motivated to do anything I want if I'm just determined enough. That part of me exists because I have this freedom to choose. I could elect to get up early every day and work out, to be superbly diligent with how I spend my time, and to only eat food that I know is actually good for me and that I actually need. And yet, over and over again, I sleep in, scroll through Twitter, and mow through cookies as if they're about to go extinct. Would it be my fault if I ballooned up to 800 pounds and died of a heart attack before I turned 40? Of course. I chose to do that to myself. But if my loved ones, namely my wife, didn't at least try to get me to lay off the Oreos once in a while, they would have failed in their responsibility as well. And doubtless such a failure would eat at them. I know it did with me in this game, as I stared at the blank space where Juhani's head was supposed to be. I failed her. Sure, her choice was her own. I was not responsible for her turning to the dark side in the first place, and I did technically try to bring her back around, but, well,
that's not good enough!
In a story whose main theme is the ever-present possibility of redemption, it felt dreadfully wrong to deny Juhani the chance to come back to the light, even if it was done at her request, because I knew I had made a mistake, that I had come up short. And the awful truth is that the sins of our past, even our immediate past, cannot be uncommitted. We're ignoring the possibility of saves coming for the time being, but we can be healed from them. Such healing requires us to answer one simple question.
But what will you do now?
Would I let this failure of mine drive me down a dark path, convinced that because I failed Juhani, I could not save anyone else, that death and destruction were the only things I could leave in my wake? Or would I swear to do better next time? Naturally, I tried my best to never again see the words dark side points gained. Heck, I even reloaded multiple times in an attempt to get these sand people to talk to me, but for whatever reason they simply refused to, even when I walked in there with my best and HK-47's weapons unequipped. I'm sure I tripped some hidden mechanic that prevented them from electing the peaceful option. But regardless, they kept attacking despite my best efforts, so at some point there was nothing I could say except,
So you have chosen death.
I mean, I suppose I could have just walked away, but I had some Jawas to rescue and a star map to find, so sorry, sand fellas. At least you can take solace in the fact that this will certainly be the last time a Jedi lays waste to one of your population centers. But this encounter highlights yet another crucial point in the game's philosophy, one that has remained true for pretty much the entirety of human existence. Doing the right thing is hard. When faced with a dichotomous choice, the better option will almost always be the more difficult one. We saw this earlier with Juhani, as I relented earlier than I should have and accepted her request for death. And again, as I finally opted to let the Sand People throw themselves at my lightsaber. I would not, however, let this pattern repeat itself forever. I swore that I would break the cycle, and my resolution held firm even in the face of a hypothetical question, as a mysterious hologram quizzed me about the choice I would make during a prisoner's dilemma, and whether I would sacrifice citizens for the sake of a military victory. I held firm on both counts, refusing to turn on my theoretical fellow captive, and choosing to evacuate the imaginary citizens. As a result, the hologram, being a remnant of an empire that was built, as most empires are, through constant battles, conquests, and slaughters, unleashed a couple of droids at my little gang, and made us fight to prove ourselves worthy of seeing the oh-so-precious star map. If I had just lied, had simply said what the bloodthirsty computer had wanted to hear, it would have been far easier for me. I wouldn't really mean it, after all. The problem is, of course, that giving in to small, seemingly meaningless temptations such as that far too often leads to giving into larger and more harmful ones. If you would like to see an entire show about how damaging it can be to yourself and those whom you love if you consistently take the easy way out, I cannot recommend Better Call Saul enough. I appreciated that KOTOR made a light side playthrough in many ways more difficult than a dark side one. If you were true to your Jedi roots, you wouldn't threaten shopkeepers or prisoners so they give you what you want, and you are saved the hassle of having to scrounge up more credits or crack the mathematical codes on the key cards. If the only thing you had to do in order to do the right thing every single time was select the top dialogue option, the theme wouldn't hit home in the same way. I needed that temptation, which, believe me, I fell for more than once, to remind me that redeeming myself would be no easy choice. Again, I say choice very intentionally rather than task or job, because ultimately it is a choice, and that choice is always present, no matter how much I might have failed along the way. Naturally, though, I was not the only one struggling with my demons, not the only one holding on to something that was poisoning me. I am, of course, referring to Karth, who from the very beginning of the game expresses his detest for Revan, Malak, and their followers, and then later tells the story of how Saul Kareth, his former mentor, betrayed him and bombed his home world, killing Karth's wife and causing Karth's son to go MIA. What happened to that kid anyway? Oh, he was at the Sith Academy. I never noticed him there. Okay, that one's not on me. I can't be expected to talk to every random Sith student when Bastila is currently being tortured by Darth Malak. But we'll talk about her in a minute. Let's stay focused on Karth, this struggling, broken man who fights because it's the only thing he can do, and whose quest for revenge is the only real motivation he has left. And of course, when Saul is down but not quite out, I am duty-bound to urge Karth to not act out of hatred and exact vengeance on the man who is beaten and not worth killing. I wish my choice of dialogue there had any effect whatsoever on this scene and Karth's character arc, but alas, it does not. Still, it's a crucial story beat that shares its nature with any number of stories that display the true nature of revenge. It only serves to hollow us out further, our pain replaced by nothing, leaving us even more lost than we were before. I think the only revenge story in which a character is actually fulfilled by his vengeance is Gladiator, but Maximus has so much more going on with his character than merely the desire to kill Commodus, a topic for a future video. Returning to the story at hand, the emptiness that Karth experienced at Saul's death pushed him to understand that exacting vengeance against me, that is, Revan, would similarly bring him no peace. But there's precious little time for feelings now, as Bastila has been captured after our encounter with Malak, during which he revealed my former identity. And I want to talk about that reveal, not so much the twist itself, but rather the revelation that the Jedi Council wiped my mind, and instilled it with the memories and personality of a loyal Republic soldier. They essentially programmed me to fight for them as if I was a battle droid, which is a pretty terrible thing to do to a person. You can argue with me on this point if you want, but in no way, shape, form, or nature is such an action ever morally justifiable. If anything was going to make me turn on the Jedi, it would be that. How could I side with the people who stripped away my very identity? It reminds me of Luthen's monologue in Andor. He knows his actions are despicable, that he is not justified in his sacrifice of Anto Krieger for the sake of his larger goal, even if that larger goal is just. And yet, I can hardly blame any members of the rebellion for continuing to fight alongside Luthen. Of course they choose to fight, rather than lie down and welcome the darkness of the Empire. So then, what will I do? Do I react in shock and horror at the Jedi Council's actions, equate them to the Sith, and turn on the Republic? Do I accept their actions as justifiable, an impossible choice in an impossible situation? Or do I simply choose to move on? To accept that what was done is done, that I cannot change what happened to me, however horrifying it may be, but must instead rely on the judgment I have formed on my journey? I think you know the answer.
I never look back, darling. It distracts from the now.
The most important step a man can take is the next step. Always the next step. The galaxy does not deserve to be punished for the atrocity of the Jedi Council. To turn on the Republic would be vengeance, not justice. It would be an action taken out of anger, and one that could not possibly provide fulfillment or peace. The measure of a man is what he does with power. Do we give in to our base instincts and strongest emotions, or do we choose to be better than, as overly sarcastic Productions puts it, our basic bitch selves? And yes, I'm talking about God of War again. I'm not sorry. Revan could choose to be Revan again, to ascend back to his former villainous glory, a path that would be far easier than the one that, of course, I chose, to reject the man I once was, whatever my feelings may be toward Jedi leadership, and be the hero the Republic needs. But not just the Republic. Because of course, a story with such a grand scope is at its best when it manages to incorporate a personal element in order to achieve balance. In this case, that relationship is found in Bastila, who has been my near constant companion ever since we rescued her on Terrace, who I have seen struggle with her own impulsiveness and strong will, who has expressed her admiration of how I managed to make the right choice time after time. She is thankfully quite forgiving of the aforementioned failures. And who I left locked in single combat with Darth Malak. A confrontation that led to the predictable outcome of her turning to the dark side. The allure of Malak's power evident in the torture he freely inflicted upon her, too much for her conflicted mind. Naturally, I did my best to call her back to the light, even as she attempted to call me back to the dark. And then when both of us failed, she ran away, which seems decidedly un-Sith-like to me. But of course, that was just to set up the final confrontation between us on the Starforge, giving me one last chance to help her find the path to redemption. And look, I have to be honest, I totally failed on my first attempt. I didn't get enough invisible convince Bastila points, or whatever were needed for her to agree to help me take down Malak for the sake of the Republic, and I was forced to kill her. But I save-scummed. I pulled a Superman after Lois Lane gets buried in a landslide and turned back time because I refuse to repeat my Juhani failure. Make of that what you will. The central struggle that must be overcome in this encounter is not Bastila's lust for the power of the dark side, and certainly not any ideological belief she holds. Rather, it is the belief that her mistakes make her irredeemable that must be purged from her mind. This is why KOTOR is a true Star Wars story that, despite its incredibly outdated gameplay and extremely basic talking head method of storytelling, has stood the test of time. After all, the original trilogy is capped off by the greatest villain in cinematic history choosing redemption, turning from the path he had walked for decades and acting out of love rather than out of hate. Bastila's redemption pales in comparison to Anakin Skywalker's, at least in terms of how heavy a burden she has to lift off her chest in order to be redeemed. As far as we have seen, she has done barely anything other than swear allegiance to Malak, and yet she already feels as if that single betrayal of her former ideals makes her unworthy of forgiveness. And isn't that just too perfect? There's a strong temptation to believe, once we have succumbed to our base instincts and our worst impulses, that we cannot turn back the path we have chosen. It doesn't matter how small our failings may be, they may very well appear to be the gravest sins ever committed to our eyes. So it is with Bastila. She accepts Revan's redemption, she welcomes it, but she doesn't believe that she can turn away from her own failure, even though it doesn't hold the smallest of candles to the heinous crimes of the man standing in front of her. It's easy to forgive people that we know, trust, and love. Forgiving ourselves is the hard part. But she does it. At least she did when I gave her a second chance. Hey, it was only fair. I certainly reloaded the game enough times after I had died. It hardly feels like cheating to allow Bastila the same opportunity once. No amount of save scumming could save Malik, however. Once I finally defeated the Dark Lord of the Sith, after wiping out his Jedi batteries who all look exactly alike to save dev cycles, there was no path that Malik could see towards salvation and redemption. There was only regret, only wondering if things might have ended better had his decisions not been what they were. A choice, a final rejection of mercy that was foreshadowed by the unnamed Sith ghost on Korriban, one who I offered a message of hope, but who ultimately turned it down, unable to see past his own wretchedness to allow himself to rest peacefully. Apparently, you can save that guy, I learned after I had written this script, and dang it, I really wish I had. But moving on. The most crucial line of this exchange with Malik is this one.
If you had not led me down the dark path in the first place, what destiny would I have found? I suppose you speak the truth. I alone must accept responsibility for my fate.
Malik was not a young child who was essentially brainwashed by Revan. He was a mature, yet headstrong and impulsive Jedi who was led down a dark path and then willfully continued down it, to the point where he attempted to blow his Sith master into space dust. He is Revan's failure, yes, but he is also his own. As much as we are responsible for those under our care, at some point we have to recognize that they are not us, that their choices are their own. The reverse is also true, of course. Those people whom we trust to lead, guide, and teach us are fallible and imperfect. They will fail us, just as we will fail those who rely on us. The choices we make, good or bad, do not exist in a vacuum, and yet they are our own. Are we fully culpable for every bad decision, especially those at which we have arrived thanks to those who have led us astray? Probably not, but rather than getting bogged down in a discussion of culpability, which is highly situational and quite difficult to judge, I will let someone else speak.
There's always a choice! You can choose to be better.
That is the core message of God of War Ragnarok, of Knights of the Old Republic, of the original trilogy, of so many other stories that really matter. But strangely not actually Lord of the Rings, at least not for Frodo at the end of his journey, but again, that's a topic for another day. The difficulty of any given choice may depend on our strength of will and the aid and encouragement we have or have not been given by others. But the choice is there, nonetheless. The final, fatal failure only occurs when we choose to believe that we cannot be better, that our failings make us irredeemable, that we are incapable of loving and being loved. Only if we believe those lies is our cause a lost one. The measure of a man is what he does with power. Despite its clunky gameplay and less than enthralling cutscenes, KOTOR demonstrated that concept beautifully. It let us decide who we wanted to be. It showed us the difficulties of choosing the righteous path and the cruel, despicable consequences of choosing the dark side. When you are given true freedom to shape your identity, who do you choose to be? So it was in this game, and so it is in life. Whatever you have done, what will you do now? Whoever you have been, who will you be now? The stories that really matter linger in our minds, not just because they dazzle us with beautiful vistas or engage our intellects with brilliantly written dialogue and character arcs, but because they speak to our souls, because they demonstrate universal truths about human nature, which are, no matter how good the graphics or the voice acting, truly timeless. Did I love playing KOTOR? Not particularly. It was fine. It shows its age far more than other games from that era, even other Star Wars games such as Battlefront or Republic Commando. And while the delivery of the narrative was hardly a masterpiece of storytelling, I think that's to be expected from CRPG games which are designed around player freedom, rather than telling a tightly constructed narrative. But the story was delivered what we in the industry like to call well enough. It effectively and efficiently got its central point across. And when your main theme is one such as KOTOR's, that can be enough. So there you have it, my concise and succinct thoughts on the story of Knights of the Old Republic. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and/or watch one of the videos being shown on screen now. And never forget, always the next step.